If there is just one sewing rule to rule them all, as in a little bit Lord of the Rings style there, the one sewing rule that I have learned through my own sewing and through teaching literally tens of thousands of people how to sew is that everything builds on the basics. This is the one tip that I wish I could go back and tell my little Evelyn self when I was learning how to sew. I think it would have helped me focus and be less overwhelmed in my sewing journey and ultimately see better results more quickly. This applies no matter what skill level you are, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, it still applies to me today. This building upon the basics. Let's talk about this to see how it applies to you in my own sewing and how it can help you get better results and see the results that you want in your sewing so you can master this craft. Hello, if you are just brand new to this channel, welcome so much for being here. Thank you. My name is Evelyn Wood and I've been sewing for 25 years myself, plus I was obviously 5 when I started, yes. And I've taught literally tens of thousands of people at my online sewing school, Vintage Sewing School. And I say that only because I hear this same thing reflected over and over again. And that is all my students, they see the success when they go back to the basics. And they always thank me for like, I am so glad that I went back to the basics to start my journey the right way. And that is where the success lies, I think. It is, as I said, the one tip I would go back and tell myself. Think about this. Whenever you want to learn something new, it's really part like improving the things that you thought you knew and filling in the gaps, learning something new. Improving what you didn't know because you don't know what you didn't know, right? And there's always those two elements, those two sides to learning something. Well, this idea is how I teach at Vintage Sewing School. It's the idea, the philosophy behind it. I think of it as like layering skills. So you have your basic core skills that you learn, and then it's like layering. You get a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and you build upon those basic skills and you layer and layer and layer, and you get better and better and better, right? So I always think of learning as mastering as two parts. As I said, one, the part mastering what you already knew, so getting better at the things that you thought you knew. And then two, it's like filling in the gaps, the things that you didn't know, you didn't know. Let me tell you a great example, a great story about this. Is one of my favorites. So let me tell you about Lauren. So Lauren was a friend of mine. This is way back when I was just starting teaching and I was doing in-person classes. And so Lauren was doing some medieval reenactment at the time, and she had brought to me a project that she was working on, beautiful like medieval gown, and was working on it very diligently and had, you might imagine, a seam down the back, starting from the back all the way down on this really long train. So it was probably like 2 meters long, this seam. And whilst I was teaching her through her project, she brought me another one and said, I want to wear this for insert whatever the next event was, which was in not enough time to really complete a project like that, but nonetheless, it was on the charts and wanting to do. And so I was like, okay, look, she was starting to stress out a bit. So I was like, let's do this quick. I can help you out here. Let me get a big chunk of this sort of done for you so you can work on the finishing stuff so it's for your project. And she was like, oh, great. And so what I did is I grabbed it and this big 2 long meter seam, I just put right sides together. I fiddled with it. I played with it. I got everything adjusted and I put it under. I had an industrial machine, I still do, of course, and just sewed it. And I just like sped through and just sewed it so I could get the shell for her to then she could finish it. And I never forget the look in her eyes when she saw how fast I did, and her jaw dropped when she saw that I did that without using pins either. She was gobsmacked at how fast I did it with no pins, and it was just like this shell of a garment just appeared in like 20 minutes. She couldn't believe it. And so I never forget that, because she just literally looked at me and was like, you did that without any pins? No pins? Like, so here's the point, is the concept of that. She had no idea that that was a thing that she could do. She didn't know that was something that to aim for, or it was done, or anything. Really pointed out the things that you don't know what you don't know. And so there's always more to learn, even on basic things like sewing a straight line, right? And so part of that is, what are the basics included in that? Is really knowing how to ease and manipulate fabric. so not needing as many pins to hold it in place, right? I could do it with my fingers at the machine because I had mastered that skill. I'd mastered the skill of like knowing where to start and stop and how far I could go on my machine, even just like with my arms and going. I knew this foot pedal and how fast I could go with that fabric. I had mastered all these things that allowed me to sew a straight seam super quick and fast without any pins, right? It's going back to those basics. So I've got a few other examples, but let's talk about like what this might look like. What does going back to some basics, what are some basics to really focus on that might be useful, that might look for in your sewing, like what it might look like in your sewing? It could look like using your machine better. So all of those sewing feet that come with your machine aren't just for decoration. They have uses. Understanding how to use them give you more application and more value out of your sewing machine just by learning that. Learning how to set the dials. Your particular machine does things differently. Learning all the principles and just like how to maneuver the fabric, how your foot pedal likes it, whether your machine likes reversing or not, and how it likes to zigzag. All those little particulars to get to know your machine really well. It's a tool, so how you use it, mastering that, makes you a better sewer straight away. Coming back on how to handle and manipulate fabric is a big one. It's really overlooked because you just don't see it when you're a beginner. That ability to maneuver the fabric and really ease in different parts, your top layer, your bottom layer, and so they work differently. You don't want one to stretch out than the other. Using your fingers and your hands to actually sew it under the foot rather than just having the foot and putting the pedal down and you're going, okay, so you are there like holding it and telling it what to do the whole time is a really skill. It's going back to the basics, right? Just how to handle and manipulate fabric as it goes under the machine. It's a really basic core skill. As you get more complicated sewing techniques get easier if you know how to handle and master that art of running fabric under your foot, right, under the machine. It could look like coming back to basics with fabrics. So really understanding the fibers and fabrics, what the difference is, what's the difference between them, how different fabrics perform and drape and stretch and don't stretch, how they sheen, like so many different elements, because then you can pick more appropriate fabrics for your designs that you're making and therefore will get better results when you go back to basics rather than just thinking, I know what cotton is, I know what linen is, I know what a satin is. Really understanding what and how and what they like, what they don't like, how to use them better for different designs will make your garments look so much better. Coming back to those basics. The basic principle of picking a size is a huge one. So we often think, I know how to read patterns and I know how to pick my size now. There's a size chart on the back, right? There's coming back to this. If you're still getting results that are mixed, and so much time and fitting, coming back to the basics of how to choose a better size for yourself, i.e. by learning things about finished garment measurements, by learning how to not just find them on the pattern, but to measure them on the pattern, right? Measure out the finished garment measurements. That way you can know what it's going to be on everything. Knowing how much ease you like on garments and coming back to use all that information to better pick a sewing pattern size is going back to those basics, but it makes everything easier when you learn those skills. Adjusting your pattern is so much easier. Fitting your pattern is easier when it already is closer to the right size, right? I think you get an idea of how mastering those basics really builds and allows for greater skills to be layered and built on top of those basics, right? It could mean learning different hemming techniques. So rather than just following the pattern and going by its instructions step by step, if you go back to basics in learning different hemming techniques, then you can start to decide for yourself which one you want to use for that particular garment, right? If you go back to basics of cutting out your fabric and not just putting all the notches and those silly little squares and dots where a lot of patterns will tell you to, but knowing why they're there, learning how to use them properly, then you can start making your own notches and using notches more appropriately in your sewing and your pattern making so that it helps you get better. And then you can make patterns easier when you know what your notches are there for and the appropriate ones are actually on your pattern. It sews up more easily. There's less going back and forth and having to match things up and things not work because all of your markings are properly on your pattern. When you really master those types of things, everything else gets easier after that. I think having this idea really helps simplify the process of learning rather than getting overwhelmed thinking like you want to sew this like really big thing or learn this new technique or like get really good and do all this stuff, right? That's way up here and you get so overwhelmed thinking that you need to learn all of this new stuff, right? But if you take it on that it is learning some new stuff, but it's also mastering those basic skills. Think about in that thing that you want to reach for. What are some basic principles within that will like really help facilitate all of the other things that you need for that skill? You know, mastering the fabric, manipulating the sewing under the sewing machine, mastering your own sewing machine, things like this that will help build and get you there. An example from my own sewing is to do with hand sewing. So this is a really good example. I love this one. So in my own sewing journey, for hand sewing, like a hemming, just a hem, I could do, you know, basic whip stitch and everything. And then I was like, well, I want to do something really fancy. Look at that. Insert some beautiful, like, hand finished couture, someone who like is a tailor their whole lives, high end, high street type, really looks like embroidery art rather than an actual just hemming something, right? You know what I mean? So it's like so fancy and beautiful looking too. And you think, I thought, I want to do that. That looks so pretty, right? And I would start and it was just so complicated. It was turning out rubbish, to be honest. When I first started, it was rubbish results. And I was like, okay, how can I go back to the basics here and just really master this? So I went back to my basic whip stitch. And then over time, I realized there's lots of things that I improved. So I could hide the little tails, the little knots and the threads at the end. I learned how to hide them underneath so they're not visible. So the stitching is just like flawless when it comes out and off and hiding those knots and tails. I learned how to, I actually realized that as I was sewing, I would twist my needle a lot and it would sort of twist and come back and forth, and my hand was like do all these types of things as I pulled it this way. So I really focused on just coming in and out and not twisting my arm, my hand, my needle, and I found I got way less knots and it was neater along the way. I also learned new tools. So I learned about thread wax, right? Just some beeswax to run over your thread to get less knots. I had so much better result. And I even learned a secret technique about getting even stitches. So putting a little marks on my thumb so that I could use it as a little measuring guide when I was sewing. That way that they're there and I got nice even stitches. And I mean, this wasn't in one go, this was over time. But by doing this, my simple little basic whip stitch, it looks so good now. I mean, it looks really, really good. And so now when I try any new hand sewing technique, because I have a core foundation of not twisting the needle, of knowing what tools, the thread wax to use, of hiding my knot and making it strong, any more difficult advanced technique that I try now is so much easier and I get better results with it because I've mastered those basic core principles of hand sewing. And don't get me wrong, I know for a fact there are still more that I need to learn too because we are never finished learning. So think about it. I bet you already have an idea of how this could apply to your own sewing, or maybe you already have applied it to your own sewing. I would love to hear it in the comments below. I would absolutely joy to read them, and you read them too. And if you're really ready to start mastering the craft of sewing and you want that guide, that mentor, that help, this is what I do at Vintage Sewing School. It's not about vintage clothing, it's about vintage sewing techniques where you can learn to master this craft and art so you can get to sew beautiful clothes that you dream of. I would love to help you do that. That is what I do. Head on down below. I'm going to leave some links down there for you to click and join us. Until next time, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.